everyone, it's Tarrant.
And Stella here from Meeple University on the Dice Tower. Thanks for joining us.
Today we'll be teaching you how to play Utopia, game designed by James Henchman Price and published by Gravity Games. We are using a prototype copy here of the game, and so the rules and components may not be final.
Let's get to it.
In the late 25th century, human society has devolved into a dystopia, but you have access to time travel technology. Now you and your faction can go back through all of what you perceive to be the mistakes in history, recruiting some of the great leaders and relying on some of the great technologies of the past in your attempts to change the future. Players will race to complete butterfly effect missions, small changes to events of the past that will ripple through time to change the future. The first player to complete 3 butterfly effect missions will win the game. But be warned, as some of the changes you make in the past may have unintended effects on everyone's future. In this video, we'll first take you through the competitive mode of the game, and then the solo and 2-player cooperative modes. Lay out the board. All of these spaces in the board represent different time zones throughout history, ranging from Imperial China in 500 BC up to Andromeda in the 25th century. Each time zone is indicated by a number. You'll use only time zones 1 through 8 in a 2-player game, 1 through 10 in a 3-player game, and all 12 in a 4-player game. In the centre, place the stacks of knowledge discs: culture, politics, science, exploration, and military. These are the game's resources. Each of the game's time zones has 6 cards associated with it, 4 crew members and 2 technologies. For each of the time zones that you're playing with, shuffle up all of those cards and then place them in a face-up stack on the board. When you're done, check how many piles have crew on top. There must be at least 2 crew per player plus 1, so if you don't have enough, start from the earliest time zones and remove cards to the bottoms of their decks until you have enough crew. Go through the mission deck and remove any missions that correspond to time zones not in your game. Then shuffle the deck, deal 3 missions face up, and leave the rest in a pile in time zone 8. Near the board, place the B and C piles of alternate time zones for later use. These should not be shuffled. Each player takes a player board and its matching coloured pieces, 5 chronoships and 4 drones. One player is designated the first player. In turn order, players draft their first crew members, choosing any one face-up crew from the board, placing it in the slot which matches this primary icon, and moving the matching chronoship onto this space. Then in reverse turn order, starting from the last player, players will draft their second crew, with the only restriction being that the second crew cannot be of the same type as the first crew. You'll have 3 leftover chronoships which are placed up here in your dock for if you get the matching type of crew later in the game, and you'll also move your 4 drones into the dock. Finally, as starting resources, each player gains 1 knowledge disc corresponding to each of the crew they begin the game with. You're now ready to play. Utopia is a round-based worker placement game where the player's workers are the chronoships which have crew in the matching slots. Each round is played in turns, and on a turn a player will move one of their chronoships onto an unoccupied action space or time zone location and take the corresponding action. Each of these large white circles around the board represents a time zone location. Anytime a chronoship is placed, 4 types of actions may trigger. Firstly, if any technology has previously been developed in that time zone, then that technology will trigger for its owner. Secondly, the active player resolves the action on the time zone location that was chosen. Thirdly, if applicable, the primary ability of the crew whose chronoship was used on the action is resolved. And then fourthly, the secondary ability of the crew whose chronoship was used is resolved. Additionally, on your turn, you may complete one, but no more than one, butterfly effect mission, as long as you meet its requirements. The first player to complete 3 of these wins the game immediately. Once you have no chronoships left to place, then you pass your turn, and once all players have passed, the round is over, and you'll reset for the next round. You'll continue playing rounds in this way until a player has won the game. Now we'll take you through the key actions in the game, starting with the simplest, which is these 5 actions on the right-hand side of time zones 2 to 6. Each of these corresponds to one of the types of knowledge disk in the game, and when you send your chronoship there, simply take one of the matching knowledge disk. These are also where you'll use your crew's primary ability. If the primary ability matches, you'll gain an extra resource disk. So if you used the scientist on this exploration, you would gain 1 exploration disk. But if instead you used your explorer, you would gain 2. Resource disks are not intended to be limited by the number of components in the game. Available only in the 3 or 4 player games is the similar action called the variable knowledge. This acts exactly like the collect knowledge space, which matches the current top card in that time zone. So this would be a collect military space, allowing a player to collect a single military knowledge or 2 military knowledge with a military crew. If the top card is tech rather than a crew, then it is always considered to match with science. This action at time zones 1 and 10 allows you to exchange knowledge, and when you visit, you may either exchange 1 single knowledge for another knowledge, or exchange 2 matching knowledge for 2 other matching knowledge. The locations at time zone 8 allow you to gain a new mission card to complete, and do note that there's only 1 open space in a 2-player game. Both are available at 3 or 4. To take the action, choose any one of the 3 face-up missions, adding it to the next empty slot on your board, then slide any unclaimed missions down and replenish from the top of the deck. If all of your mission slots are full, you can also use the action to replace one of your unfinished missions with one from the board, placing your old one on the bottom of the draw pile before replenishing. Each of these action spaces, present at every time zone except time zone 8, allows you to gain the top card of that time zone's deck, either developing the technology or recruiting the crew. There are 3 ways this can happen. To recruit a crew whose primary type you already have, you simply swap the crew members out. So here, this crew member would go back on the bottom of its time zone's deck, and this crew member would be added to the matching slot on your board. You would mostly do this to gain a more advantageous secondary ability. To recruit a crew member whose primary ability does not match one that you already have, then you must pay the matching type of knowledge disks with the number based on how many crew you have. Your 3rd crew member costs 2 of the matching knowledge disk. Your 4th costs 3 and your 5th costs 4. Move the crew to its matching slot on your player board and then move its matching chronoship into position. Having this extra chronoship will give you an extra action every round, starting from the round when you took it. If the top card is tech, then you can develop that tech, and this always costs 2 science knowledge disks. Place the tech card next to the time zone like so, and put one of your unused drones on the card. Your 4 drones are used to mark ownership in a variety of contexts in the game, and they are limited, so you must have a drone available to take this action. Each time zone has 2 technology cards, 1 communication and 1 transport, and it is possible for both of them to have been developed at the same time, either by the same or different players. Technology serves 2 functions. Firstly, anytime a chronoship goes to a time zone location, before that location is activated, each technology is activated, allowing the owner to gain a knowledge disk matching the technology. Secondly, completing some of the game's missions requires the player to have developed and then give up one or more technologies, meaning there's an important balance between hanging on to them for the resources and spending them for the win. The final time zone action is assassinate, located in time zones 7 and 11. 3 things happen when you take this action. Firstly, you must choose another player's chronoship which is already deployed to a time zone location, with the exception of one deployed to the other assassinate space. You assassinate that chronoship, sending it to limbo. Then you must replace it with a drone from your supply. If you have no drones in your supply, you can't take the action. The drone now carries out the time zone location action where it is placed. So here the player could recruit this crew. Then the assassin player gains the first player marker and will play first from the next round. It's important to note that the drone only triggers the time zone location effect. It doesn't trigger tech, and you can't use the chronoship's crew member abilities in the drone's time zone. For this play here, this chronoship would have triggered this tech, then triggered this time zone location, and then only triggered the secondary effect if it were relevant in time zone 7. And that covers all of the different actions available on the board. As we mentioned before, each of your crew will have a primary and secondary ability, and all of the primary abilities are of the form that will give you a second knowledge disk of the matching type when you use the corresponding action space. There is a mixed range of secondary abilities, some of which work like primary abilities, and others which make other actions stronger or cheaper. The full rules for these are outlined in the rulebook. Once per turn, you may complete a butterfly effect mission. Each mission has 2 requirements which you must spend, and 1 location where you must be. So to complete this one, you would need to spend 4 exploration knowledge disks, 1 transport technology, and have moved your chronoship in this round to time zone 6. Knowledge disks are simply returned from your board to the supply, and tech may be spent from any time zone by returning its card to the bottom of its deck and returning its drone to your player board. You have now changed the course of human history, and so you create an alternative time zone. Go to the alternative time zone decks and find the card which matches your mission. In this case, it's 6C. Read both sides of this card, as it gives you 2 different ways which your faction could use this new timeline to your advantage. Once you've chosen the one you want, move the chronoship which completed the mission to its new altered timeline. If you still have a drone on your player board, then place it here to signify that you own this timeline, and then take the action printed on that timeline twice, once for the chronoship and once for the drone. Some of these actions are the same as ones we've already seen, and some of them come with new icons, which are explained on the back of the rulebook. Many of these icons are shared between alternative time zones and crew secondary abilities, and you'll see on the back of the book that these are resolved in slightly different ways. This one when it's used as a secondary ability, and this one when used in an alternative timeline. At the end of each round, chronoships are removed from alternative timelines, but drones remain. Then, in future rounds, this space acts like a new time zone location which any player may go and use. Anytime it's activated, the action can be done twice, once by the player who placed a chronoship and once by the player who owns the drone. This means if a player visits their own timeline, they get to do the action twice. If the chronoship in an alternate timeline is assassinated, then the drone that replaces it can do the action once, but the drone already there does not get to do it a second time. Utopia's laws of time travel allow for parallel timelines to exist and be accessed by all players, so there would be nothing stopping a player from accessing the original timeline 6 rather than the alternative one. In this instance, there's no change to the action that the yellow player will have taken here. However, alternative time zones are unstable. In a two-player game, you can only have a single B and a single C time zone open at once. At 3 players, you can have 2 Bs and 1 C. And at 4 players, you can have 2 of each. If you ever need to add an alternative time zone and there's no space, then discard one of the matching type, B or C, return any drone on it to its owner, and move any chronoship which happens to be on it into limbo. Then set up the new timeline in the usual way. Once all players have passed out of a round, then you'll go to phase 2, which is recovering, refreshing and resetting, and the steps of this are shown here. Firstly, players with chronoships in limbo have to pay to get them out of limbo, the cost of which is 1 knowledge disk matching that ship's type, or 2 knowledge disks not matching. If the player cannot or chooses not to pay, then the ship remains in limbo, reducing the number of actions the player has for the next round. As you can see, this makes assassination a very cutthroat part of the game, both being a fight for the first player marker and costing your victim resources. Once players have made decisions on limbo, any time zone with no ships or drones in an action space are refreshed by moving the top card to the bottom of the deck. If this applies to time zone 8, move the bottom mission to the bottom of the deck and then slide down and replenish from the top. Finally, all players retrieve any chronoships, excluding those in limbo, and any drones used for actions. Any ownership drones should remain on the board. You'll now proceed to the next round. Players continue playing rounds in this manner until one player has completed 3 butterfly effect missions. The game ends immediately and that player is the winner. In the solo mode, you will play a 2-player game against an automated opponent representing one of the villains in the game, and there are 10 villains of differing difficulties. This mode offers a tight worker placement challenge, as the enemy may block you out from your spaces and you'll need to try to block the enemy. However, villain progress is tracked along this track on the villain card, as the villain neither gains nor loses knowledge discs, and there are a few changes to the mechanics to deal with that. To set up, choose your villain and place it over its matching space, giving it its matching chronoship. Put one of its drones on the drone slot, give it a random mission and the first player marker. Shuffle the remaining villains face down. The backs of this deck will give you the villain's actions and randomizer. To find the villain's second starting crew, check the time zone showing on the back of the card, and as its second starting crew, recruit the crew member from that time zone or the next time zone clockwise with a valid crew member to recruit. Only then do you recruit your starting crew. The villain always takes its first turn with the chronoship on its villain card, and then each subsequent turn goes from left to right. To start a turn, discard the top card from the villain deck, revealing the new action icon and time zone icon relevant to this turn. Then attempt to move the villain's chronoship to the location showing here. Here, for example, it would be the trade icon. Here, it would be the space corresponding to the top of the 2 requirements on its active mission card, so here the culture space. And in a similar vein, here it would be the bottom one, so the military space. If the mission card shows one of the techs in this location, then it will attempt to go to the science space. In this way, it's as if the villain is trying to go to the spaces that will give it the resources it would need for this mission. If the action space is vacant, then the action is a success. You'll put the chronoship there, then move the drone down 1 space and resolve the bonus action on that space. The bottom bonus action on the card is to complete a mission, and so once the villain has had enough successes to go through the card 3 times, the villain will win the game. If the relevant action space is occupied, then the villain's action fails, and this is what you want because it's going to stop the villain from making progress. The villain's chronoship is placed in the next time zone clockwise, which has its rightmost action space available. The villain will never go into a recruit or tech slot unless it's the only one available, and never goes to an alternative time zone. When the villain fails to act in this way, all it does is blocks this space. Think of it as you've forced the villain to take a useless action by blocking up the useful ones. Villains cannot trigger their own tech. I won't take you through how every one of the villain's bonus actions works. Once again, you can read that in the rulebook. However, generally speaking, when a bonus action interacts with the main board, it's going to attempt to do that action in the time zone showing on the top card. And if it can't be done, it will continue trying time zones clockwise around the board until one is found. For example, this bonus action would be to develop a comms tech in time zone 3. And this would result in the next comms tech clockwise from time zone 3 being developed like so. As mentioned before, the villain does not gain knowledge discs, and so, generally speaking, in any instance where the villain would gain a knowledge disc, the player instead loses a knowledge disc. So here, by activating this time zone, the player would lose a culture or a politics, if possible. The reverse applies if the villain were to lose knowledge discs. Here, for example, the villain always retrieves its chronoships from limbo, and rather than spending matching knowledge, the player gains it. When the villain completes a mission, simply flip the mission card over, without creating an alternative timeline, gain the top face-up mission card, replenishing in the usual way, and return the drone to the top of the track. If this was the villain's third mission, then the villain wins and you lose. You can also play in the 2-player cooperative mode, in which 2 human players will take on 2 game villains. Set the villains up in the same way that we saw for the solo mode, with the higher difficulty villain as the first player, and with each villain assigned to one of the human players. This allows both players to control one of the AIs, and the AIs will sometimes target the player that controls them. All of the villain crew cards are chosen before the players draft theirs. The villains choose their action spaces using the cards in the same way, but now there are more than one copy of some of the action spaces on the board. When this happens, the general rule is that you first attempt to fill the lowest numbered time zone space, and if that one had been full, then you would go to the higher numbered. If that one had also been occupied, then for the failed action, continue counting clockwise from the higher numbered space. For the top or bottom action, remember to take into account the variable knowledge spaces. In this case, if the green villain were hunting exploration and you'd blocked this space, this would still be a valid location for exploration because that is the matching icon, and it would count as a successful action. The villains are working together, so any bonus action which targets another player will always target a human player, even if the time zone would normally mean it targeted the other villain. Unlike the basic game, which ends when a single player completes all 3 missions, the 2-player co-op mode will only end when both players on a single team complete all missions. Once one villain is finished, that villain will directly help its teammate, such that any successful action that villain takes results in the teammate's drone being moved down. Human players can't directly help each other in this way, they must each complete their own missions. However, they do have the benefit of being able to strategically work together to trigger each other's tech. And that's how to play Utopia.
Check out the project page of Utopia. We'll put the link in the description below, so you can check it out. If you find this video useful, please help us by hitting that like button and subscribe to the Dice Tower if you haven't already done so.
And if you have any questions, comments or feedback, please leave that in the comments section below.
Thanks for watching and see you next time.